Hey guys. Tonight we're following a very specific smell-warm bread laced with ancient perfume deep into the stone silence of an Egyptian tomb. The air is dry, the torchlight flickers, and what you thought was a pile of dusty rocks turns out to be a loaf. Yep, a loaf of bread. Left here over 3,000 years ago, tucked lovingly beside a linen-wrapped corpse. It's stiff, blackened, and definitely not edible anymore, but if you lean in close, there's still a ghost of something sweet. Maybe myrrh, maybe cinnamon, maybe just time playing tricks on your nose. See, the Egyptians didn't just bury their dead with treasures and cats. They left behind loaves, and not plain ones either. These breads were shaped like birds, scented like incense, and in some cases get this glazed with tree resin. Why? Because apparently dying wasn't an excuse to stop being extra. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and if you're listening from somewhere strange, a tent in Iceland or a couch in Manila, drop your location and your local time in the comments. I'm always curious where this little time machine lands. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing in a tomb, not a grand one like Tut, but one of the middle tier types, still carved from solid limestone, still painstakingly painted, and still eerie in the way only a chamber meant for permanent sleep can be. There's a low niche carved into the wall, and nestled in it are objects once held dear. A wooden game board, a clay pot of dried figs, and beside them moodily 2 loaves of bread, curled slightly like crescent moons. One smells faintly sweet. Even now, it's strange. You'd expect dust, maybe the acrid tang of ancient decay, but not this. Not a fragrance so light it almost dances behind your nostrils. This isn't some random accident of preservation. This was intentional. And you're not the first to notice it. When archaeologists first cracked open certain burial chambers in the early 20th century, they reported an odd perfume hanging in the air. Not incense, not flowers-baked bread. Except this bread wasn't moldy or rotting. It had been treated, preserved, and in many cases, purposefully perfumed. You try to imagine the person, probably a priest or a temple baker, kneading dough, not just for eating, but for eternity. Sprinkling in dried herbs, or drizzling a fragrant resin over the top, not to feed a living mouth, but to please a god. Or maybe to impress a dead relative. And that's the curious part. The Egyptians believed strongly in the afterlife, but not in a vague, floaty way. Their version of heaven was deeply material. You would wake up, walk around, get hungry, and ideally, you'd have food nearby, preferably good food, ideally. Bread. Now imagine being the deceased. You've gone through all the proper rituals, the elaborate embalming, the parade of mourners. You're resting in your tomb, and suddenly you wake up afterlife style. You stretch, yawn, and what's that? Smell? It's not decay. It's fresh bread. You turn, and there it is. That same loaf you were buried with. Still waiting. Still fragrant. The ultimate comfort food, but also a spiritual offering, a kind of edible prayer. There's a catch, though. Scholars still argue whether the Egyptians believed these loaves would be eaten literally or symbolically. Some say the scent alone was enough, that the aroma was meant to satisfy the soul in the way food satisfies the body. Others think it was more ritualistic, that smelling the bread acted like a metaphysical snack, something that fed the ka, the spiritual double that lived alongside your corpse. What's certain is that these loaves weren't ordinary. They were shaped like animals, inscribed with blessings, and often baked with additives like juniper berries, sweet wine, or fat from sacred animals. Some even included lotus petals or powdered frankincense. It's like someone made a focaccia and then asked, what if this also summoned divine favor? And here's the wild fringe theories. Some historians believe the scent wasn't just for the dead. It may have been for the living mourners too. Imagine walking into the tomb for that final goodbye, the priest chanting, the air thick with incense. And then warm spiced bread, its aroma cutting through the grief. A signal of nourishment, of continuity, maybe even hope. But not everyone was on board. The economic records show that perfumed bread wasn't cheap. Only elites could afford loaves baked with foreign resins or rare oils. So of course, some people cheated. Tomb robbers weren't the only ones cutting corners. Some lower-tier tombs contained what looked like bread, but on closer inspection turned out to be mud loaves dusted with barley flour. Spiritual catfishing, ancient-style. Still, in high tombs, those of priests, nobles, and minor royals, the real deal endured. Even today, researchers at museums sometimes crack open a sealed vessel and detect that unmistakable sweetness, like a ghostly bakery. It's a funny thought. All the towering pyramids, colossal statues, and gold leaf sarcophagi, and here we are, talking about crusty bread, but maybe that's the point. In the end, what people took with them wasn't just treasure. It was comfort, smell, memory, the kind of thing that lingers, and as you drift further into the depths of this particular tomb, your torch catching on hieroglyphs and faded blue paint, you can't help but feel cozy, like someone long ago made sure you wouldn't be alone, because even in death, a good loaf mattered. You follow the scent upstream, tracing it through the hot air of a long-vanished afternoon, all the way back to the riverbanks, where real bread was once baked. Not in tombs, but in busy, sun-drenched bakeries just outside the temple walls. You're standing now in one of those open-air courtyards, squinting through the grit of flour and ash, while the whole place hums with heat, shouting, and the unmistakable rhythm of bread-making. Sift, knead, fire, repeat. The Nile glints nearby. Geese honk somewhere in the reeds. A clay oven shaped like an upside-down bowl radiates enough heat to crisp your eyebrows. Everything here smells like dust, sweat, and Dodley nutmeg. You notice the bakers are mostly men, which surprises you. Some wear kilts streaked white with flour, others squat near the ovens, checking the loaves with long paddles that look more like weapons than utensils. The bread they're pulling out isn't your usual supermarket sandwich fare either. Some of it's conical, some shaped like delicate fingers, some look like flat discs, and some are molded into animals, frogs, birds, jackals, and almost none of it is for dinner. This, you realize, is temple bread, sacred offerings, meant for the gods and the dead. Mainstream historians agree that ancient Egyptian temples operated like giant bakeries. They had their own grain fields, granaries, millers, and dedicated squads of bakers who produced massive quantities of bread every day, not to feed priests or visitors, but to be set on altars, carried into sanctuaries, and buried in tombs. But Here's the twist. It wasn't just plain bread. Some of these loaves were flavored. The bakers added ingredients like dates, coriander, carob, sycamore figs, and sometimes get ready ground acacia pods soaked in resin. You can almost taste it. Sweet, earthy, slightly bitter. Definitely acquired. Fringe researchers have even tried replicating these recipes based on the residue found in ancient baking molds. One team in the 1980s claimed to have made an accurate temple loaf using emor wheat, honey, and frankincense. According to the lead archaeologist, it tasted like a floral cinder block, so probably not a bestseller at your local farmer's market. But again, taste wasn't the point. Scent was. As you step around one of the long wooden tables, you see a young apprentice grinding spices with a stone mortar. There's cinnamon bark, probably imported from what's now Sri Lanka's fenugreek, a pinch of anise. He's sweating from the effort, muttering something under his breath. Like a chant, or maybe just a complaint about how the head baker is always yelling. You look at the baskets lined up beside him, woven papyrus, frayed at the corners, and inside them rest dozens of loaves, each glistening faintly. Not from butter, but from oil. Scented oil. You recognize the shine. Olive oil infused with juniper and tree sap. It's almost like a primitive glaze. You lean in, still warm, still fragrant. The temple scribe walks by with a wooden tablet, noting down deliveries. He checks each loaf, sniffs one, raises an eyebrow, scribbles a mark. Because these breads weren't just for show, they had to pass inspection. They were part of a divine economy, loaves given to the gods and the dead in exchange for favor, protection, or a smooth passage into the afterlife. In a way, you're watching a factory of metaphysical bribery. There's debate, of course. Some Egyptologists argue whether all these scented loaves were really perfumed in the modern sense. Was it about masking the smell of decay? Was it symbolic, a way of connecting to floral deities? Or was it practical? Breads lasted longer when baked with antibacterial oils and resins. You glance at a half-burnt tablet on the table, scrawled with something resembling a recipe. It translates roughly to emmer flour, water, palm oil, 2 drops of resin, bake until fragrant. No yeast, no rising, just a thick, brick-like loaf. You break off a crust hypothetically, and it crumbles like dried clay. Not delicious, but eternal. Here's something else. These temple loaves were often made in massive quantities. One record from Karnak lists over 20,000 loaves produced per month for religious offerings alone. That's more bread than your entire extended family eats in a year, and it wasn't even for people who were alive. And not all of it was destined for tombs. Some breads, after being offered, were taken back and redistributed to temple staff. This caused the occasional scandal: priests hoarding sweet loaves, scribes sneaking home spice rolls, workers complaining that the bread was missing its resin layer again. There's even an old story, likely exaggerated, about a minor temple priest being demoted because he tried to swap out his offerings with fake loaves made of dyed linen. Yes, dyed linen. He rolled them, scented them with incense, and hoped no one would check. They checked. He was reassigned to latrine duty. And here's something creepier. Some breads weren't baked at all. They were molded from dough and dried hard in the sun, never meant to be eaten, just sealed into tombs. By the time they were uncovered by modern archaeologists, they'd fossilized, still shaped like birds or lilies. Still faintly scented, still stubbornly refusing to disintegrate. As you walk through the bakery courtyard, the light begins to shift. Sunset slants through the palm trees, and someone lights a new fire under a clay oven. The air blooms with heat and spice again. You could stay here, watching this ancient performance forever, but the bread is already cooling. The scent is fading. And somewhere beyond the fields, a funeral procession has begun. Someone's died, and their tomb is waiting time to follow the bread. You're crouched, now inside a tomb, again different this time. Smaller, darker. The kind that might be overlooked on a tourist map, but one with just enough prestige to have caught the eye. Of a late-period noble who was extremely particular about his ... food. There's no gold here. No fanfare. But what you do find is tucked inside a stone basin carved into the floor, one small, round loaf, sealed in a lidded jar. It's blackened with age, hard as fired clay, but unmistakably bread. Except it's not just bread. Not with that resinous sheen catching the light. You lift the lid and catch the smell, faint but persistent balsam. Frankincense. Or maybe something rarer still. Because here's where things start to get weird. Not all bread in ancient Egypt was meant for eating. Some was perfume. Sort of. Historians still argue whether these loaves were literal food, symbolic offerings, or incense you could chew. And the deeper you look, the less clear it gets. You trace a finger along the rim of the jar, imagining what this loaf was like before time did its thing. The texture, probably sticky. The smell, almost intoxicating. Some of these breads were slathered in liquid myrrh, the myrrh that makes up 2/3 of the Christmas frankincense gold myrrh trio. A substance so aromatic it was used in embalming, cosmetics, and temple rituals. And apparently, also in snack form. Of course, you wouldn't want to snack on it. One researcher in the 1970s actually tried rehydrating a fragment of perfumed bread using distilled water in a sealed chamber. The result, a pulpy, glue-like mass that smelled like a burnt tree. He took a bite, immediately regretted it. His teeth stuck together for hours. So that's one fringe experiment you don't need to replicate. But it tells you something. These breads weren't casually scented, they were infused. Prepared in ways we still don't fully understand. Probably involving soaking, slow baking, and finishing with an oil-based glaze that locked in fragrance for millennia. Some theories suggest the scent was a kind of offering in itself, that the gods and spirits didn't eat the bread. They absorbed its essence through smell. And in a world without Febreze, maybe this was the best anyone could hope for divine aromatherapy. One odd text from a mortuary temple reads like a perfume label. The bread of saffron and myrrh pleasing to the nose of Osiris, moist to the tongue of the stars. Moist to the tongue of the stars. That's poetry-level commitment to baking. But maybe the real giveaway is in the shape. As you move deeper into the tomb, your torch catches a line of tiny molds stacked in a wall niche. Clay, palm-sized, and clearly designed to shape dough not into loaves, but into flowers. Lotus flowers, specifically. The symbolic blossom of rebirth and eternal life. So now imagine this. A perfumed loaf. Molded like a lotus. Baked with crushed petals and glazed with incense resin. Not meant to nourish, but to represent something. To whisper a message into the afterlife. I was loved, I was honored. I remembered beauty. You pause beside the niche. There's something unusually serene about it. Like someone packed these breads, not out of obligation, but out of care. You get the feeling this tomb wasn't for a pharaoh or a warrior, but maybe a perfumer, a baker, or even a scribe with a poetic streak. The walls tell part of the story. Painted scenes show baskets of bread being carried toward a shrine. Each loaf is delicately outlined in ochre, some with flecks of faded blue, likely representing herbs or scent. A priest raises one toward the sky, as though letting the gods smell it before placing it with the dead. Modern scholars are still figuring this out. Some think these perfumed loaves evolved from older practices, like offering incense sticks or scent cones worn on the head during feasts. Others believe it was just a practical fix. In hot, enclosed tombs, everything starts to stink fast. So, you counter it with something pleasant, like frankincense focaccia. But there's more than that. The loaves you're seeing in these wall scenes are arranged like ritual tools. One rests beside a mirror, one beside a wig, one beside a flint blade. Objects of identity, personality. So maybe, just maybe, these weren't generic loaves. Maybe they were scented to reflect the tastes of the person inside. Their favorite flower, their favorite spice, their favorite version of home. There's one story mostly ignored in big history books about a tomb where the bread was packed with wild mint. A scent not usually used in temple rituals. But when archaeologists traced the remains, they discovered the deceased had been a gardener. Suddenly, the choice made sense, so it's not just perfumed bread in a general sense, it's bespoke. Perfumed bread, the ancient version of a signature candle. You pick up a chunk of hardened dough from the floor crumbled centuries ago. Maybe when the tomb was first looted. It's black now, brittle, but you swear, there's still something floral in it. Something sweet, like dried jasmine and resin. You step back, taking in the whole room. It's small, but not lonely. Everything left here tells a story, not of grandeur, but of detail. A comb, a mirror, a necklace. And next to them, a fragrant loaf, made for memory, not appetite. Whatever happens to us when we're gone, you think, there's something reassuring in the idea that someone once believed a loaf of bread could carry a person into eternity. Even if it tasted like glue and smelled like an altar. You're lying flat now, well, sort of, because this tomb's ceiling is barely high enough to sit up in. And there's dust in your shoes. But you've stumbled on something fantastic. An ancient grocery list, carved directly onto the wall. Okay, maybe not a literal grocery list, but it might as well be. A grid of offerings is drawn beside the image of a reclining mummy, and it reads like a surreal dream menu. Spring onions, jars of honey, beer, salted duck, palm wine, figs, cheese, dried fish, lentils and, of course, multiple types of bread, some round, some elongated. One even labeled with the curious glyph for cloud soft. Whatever that meant. Maybe the Egyptian version of brioche. You stare at the list. It's excessive. It's oddly poetic. And it's strangely familiar, like someone planning their last ever picnic and refusing to leave out dessert. See? The ancient Egyptians didn't just bury their dead with a random assortment of food. They buried them with meals they genuinely believed would be needed after death. The afterlife wasn't this floaty, abstract concept. It was real, tactile, with proper seasons, regular meals, and lots of walking. You would wake, breathe, maybe. Do some light farming, and you'd get hungry. So why not plan ahead? This is where the perfumed bread makes its triumphant return, not as the star, but as a supporting actor in the lavish theater of eternal dining. Breads weren't just food. They were symbolic tokens of completeness, of daily life, of civilization itself. And they came in all varieties. The more well-off you were, the longer your tomb menu. Pharaohs were buried with hundreds of food models, miniature roasts, wine amphorae, tiny baskets of sculpted fruit. Some even had painted servants depicted on the walls, reaching out with trays, always offering, always waiting. But here's the curious bit. The bread section of these menus, always the most detailed. You count no fewer than 7 separate words for bread in this one tomb wall alone, each denoting a different kind. There's ta for standard loaves, henu for those used in rituals, tebani for spiced or sweetened ones, and a few more that Egyptologists still scratch their heads over. Historians still argue whether these distinctions reflected real recipes or if they were spiritual metaphors. Was Cloudsoft just wishful thinking? Or did some wealthy ancient baker invent a kind of airier loaf centuries before the French ever thought to do so? You peek into a nearby offering pit and spot more traces, crumbs fossilized into the stone, and what might be a piece of linen once used to wrap a loaf. Because in many tombs, the bread was packed like a gift, wrapped tight, sometimes sealed in jars with resin poured over the top like icing on a cake from the gods. But here's where things go full-on quirky. Some of the bread offerings weren't even real. You move into the next chamber and find a shelf lined with what look like loaves at first glance, but they're made of mud, not baked, but molded. Some are painted with ochre to imitate a crust. One even has a few pebbles embedded on top, possibly to mimic seeds. Why? Because real bread was expensive. And if your family couldn't afford to fill your tomb pantry with freshly baked loaves glazed in myrrh and scented with cinnamon, they faked it. That's love. That's budget dedication. That's lying to eternity with confidence. Archaeologists call these model loaves, and they're found in tombs across all levels of wealth. Some were stone, some were linen bundles painted brown, some were just lumps of dirt with herbs stuck in them for smell. As if saying, hey, Osiris probably won't check too closely, but the top-tier tombs, oh, they went all in. Entire feasts were staged with the real thing: roast meats, honey cakes, spiced beer, and yes, perfumed bread, packed carefully into lidded jars or baskets sealed with wax. And while you're here, you notice the jars often bear little notes, inscriptions like "for the road" or "the sweet one he liked best." Little post-it notes to the dead. You almost choke on dust when you realize you're grinning, because this is oddly sweet. For all the formality and ritual and gold, there's a deeply human tenderness in these offerings. People wanted their loved ones to be comfortable, even stylish in the afterlife. Imagine someone saying, "Don't forget to pack grandma's favorite loaf," while priests chant and embalmers do their thing. And it wasn't just about comfort, it was about balance. In Egyptian belief, death unbalanced things. Life was harmony matand, death threatened to throw everything out of tune. Perfumed bread, lovingly shaped and delicately scented, helped re-establish that order. It soothed, it quieted chaos, and maybe, just maybe, it helped the soul remember who it had been. You run a hand along the carvings, the baskets, the jars, the endless loaves, real and fake, sweet and resinous. The whole chamber is a catalogue of care, a pantry built not out of fear of death, but love of life. And that love had a smell. Warm, familiar, faintly spicy. The smell of bread, packed for a journey with no map and no certain return. The air in this tomb is thick, suffocating in a way that feels less like dust and more like the weight of unspoken histories. You step lightly over the worn stone floor, avoiding cracks that seem to lead directly into the depths of time. In front of you is another tomb niche, this one unusually deep. At first glance, it's another typical scene: jars, pottery, a few mummified figures in various states of preservation. But then your gaze lingers on a small corner, half obscured by shadowware. Something catches your eye. It's a loaf. Well, not just a loaf, but a perfect loaf, tucked delicately into a little ceramic bowl. At first, it seems almost too pristine, like something that belongs on display in a museum, not buried for millennia. You kneel to inspect it, your fingers brushing the surface. And it's not like any bread you've ever seen before. This one is soft. It should have turned to dust ages ago, but it's retained its texture somehow. It looks more like a luxurious pastry than a rustic loaf, with intricate twists in the dough, folded over in a way that looks almost ornamental, almost like something a queen might have commissioned to be placed in her tomb, not as nourishment, but as a statement. And when you lift the bowl, the scent hits you. This loaf is soaked through with myrrh, not just sprinkled on top, but infused deep into the dough itself, as if every bite was meant to be an experience of divine fragrance. You can almost imagine the luxurious sweetness, the smooth richness of the resin blending with the faint nutty earthiness of the bread. But you know better. It's been centuries. This isn't food anymore. This is an offering. You wonder, was this loaf meant to appease the gods? Was it a personal gift to the deceased, to ensure they had something sweet to enjoy for eternity? Or was it something far more practical, perhaps a way of saying to the dead, even in the afterlife, we remember what you loved most? Because here's the thing, this was no ordinary loaf. In fact, it was one of those rare instances where the bread was so intricately crafted, so perfumed, that it crossed from the realm of sustenance into something closer to pure art. Looking around, you spot an oddity that you didn't notice before. More loaves. They're lined up neatly in a row, each one uniquely designed. The one beside you is the same, spiced, glazed, delicate. Another is shaped like a bird, its wings spread wide as if in flight. A third has symbols etched into it, hieroglyphs, too intricate for someone to simply carve casually. This bread was part of something bigger, something ritualistic. Historians still argue about the symbolic value of these special loaves. Were they meant to carry specific messages to the gods, or were they simply beautiful offerings to ensure that the dead's journey into the afterlife was a smooth one? Some believe these breads were even designed to mimic the shapes of deities themselves: Horus the hawk, Isis the mother, Osiris the rebirth. On that, by leaving such loaves, they were believed to invoke the deity's blessings for eternal peace. But you've also heard the theories that bread, in itself, was an offering of remembrance. In a society where food was central to every social ritual, giving a loaf wasn't just about the gods or the dead. It was a way to ensure that a person's legacy was kept fresh, even after they were gone. After all, bread was the daily sustenance, the staple of life. Leaving it for the dead was perhaps the most genuine form of continuity, a gesture, not of divine appeasement, but of human love. The bread might rot, but the act of giving would persist. You run a finger along the hieroglyphs, carved into the edges of the bread, your thoughts running wild with images of bread shaped like gods and wrapped in mystery. It's a far cry from the dry, tasteless loaves that fill most people's daily lives today. Here, bread was a powerful force. It was the very essence of existence and a bridge between worlds, layered in oils, resins, and fragrances. The ancient Egyptians' finest art. But back to the smell, this one. The faint trace of myrrh mixed with honey. You can't help but wonder if this was part of an ancient secret, passed down only to those who could afford it. Was this bread something so rare it belonged only to the elite, to kings and queens, who might have tasted this particular variety as part of their coronation feasts and believed it would accompany them on their journey to the afterlife? Or was it something meant to be shared, passed down from generation to generation, a way to keep a spiritual connection with those long gone? You stand, lifting the bowl of bread carefully, as if it were made of the finest porcelain. It's strange, isn't it? That something as simple as bread, something most of us never give a second thought to, can carry so much weight. To the Egyptians, bread wasn't just food. It was an offering. It was a bridge to the gods. It was continuity. It was love. As you turn to leave the tomb, you can't help but wonder if, in a strange way, the Egyptians had it figured out. Maybe they understood something about the human soul we don't. That it's not just the grand gestures, the glittering gold, or the towering pyramids that matter. It's the small things, the loaves of bread, the scent of myrrh that truly make us feel immortal. The next time you take a bite of your own bread, you might catch a faint trace of something greater. A reminder that, maybe, just maybe, there's still a little bit of Egypt in the crumbs. You're standing in another tomb now. The one that actually seems to belong to a royal, well, a very minor royal, if we're being technical. The walls are more elaborate, the paintings brighter, the air richer with history. But as you step past golden amulets and polished stone, you can't help but focus on the faintest outline on the far wall, almost imperceptible at first. It's a loaf. Another loaf, this time carved into the stone itself. This isn't like the others you've seen. It's not a giant fresco of a loaf in a basket. It's not a mold or a real, living loaf, baked and sealed into jars. No, this one is a symbol. But not just any symbol. This loaf is stylized, framed by flowing lines that almost resemble flame, or perhaps the curve of a wing. It's as if it's rising. This brings you back to something you overheard during a lecture on Egyptian funerary art. Many of the bread offerings weren't meant to simply nourish the deceased. They were often placed in tombs as part of larger, symbolic motifs, a way to convey the process of renewal. To the ancient Egyptians, bread was life, and the act of creating bread symbolized resurrection. So much so that the loaf had its own connection to Osiris, the god of rebirth. The loaf's round shape, its rise from a flat, unassuming dough into something much more, mirrored Osiris's own death and resurrection after being chopped up into pieces by his brother Set. This is why you see bread carved onto the walls of tombs. It's an image of renewal. It's not meant to be eaten but to convey a deeper, metaphysical meaning. Even the simplest loaf, kneaded with love and thought, was believed to help provide that vital transition from life to the afterlife, from decay to renewal. And just like that, bread becomes a life cycle in itself. You walk closer to the carving, intrigued by the sheer detail of it. The loaf seems to shimmer, its raised edge catching the torchlight as though it were still fresh out of the oven. The lines around it to appear to swirl toward the top, mimicking the flow of smoke or incense, the scent of a resurrection. In ancient Egyptian belief, the aroma of offerings, whether it was bread, incense, or fruit, was not just for the senses. The gods could smell them, and the souls of the deceased could inhale the very essence of life and vitality that would be reborn in the afterlife. Historians still argue whether these symbolic loaves, carved into the tomb walls, were an idealized version of bread, or if they were meant to serve a more spiritual purpose, like some kind of ancient, edible prayer. Some Egyptologists suggest that carving bread into tombs was as much about ensuring a constant supply of nourishment as it was about connecting to a divine power. Others believe that the bread carved into these spaces was a perfect fusion of daily life and spiritual protection, meant to bridge the gap between the physical world and the spirit world. After all, the Egyptians weren't just creating tombs. They were constructing a miniature universe inside them. A universe where even the smallest things like bread could become powerful, eternal agents of protection. Now as you move past the loaf carving, you notice something else. A small jar, nestled at the foot of the stone wall. It's partially open. You can see the faint trace of ancient resin still clinging to the sides. The jar itself isn't large, but it feels heavy with meaning. You lean closer and catch a faint, almost imperceptible odor. This, too, is myrrh. It doesn't hit you in a wave like the breads did. It's subtle, lingering in the air as if the very scent is a whisper from the tomb's inhabitant. You wonder if they had hoped this jar would be opened in the afterlife, its fragrance released as a blessing on the soul. It's remarkable, really, how these small, seemingly insignificant details hold such weight. A loaf carved into the stone, a tiny jar of resin, the scent lingering just long enough to whisper its way into your consciousness. You realize that this is how history was built, through the smallest of offerings, the smallest of gestures. Egyptians believed that the details mattered, that every grain of flour, every drop of resin, every symbol carved into the stone was a part of an eternal equation. And then, it hits you. You're standing in a sacred place, surrounded by the very essence of continuity. Even in death, bread persists. It's a reminder that life never fully ends, that there's a sense of renewal woven through the fabric of time itself. The bread in the tombs, the myrrh, the carvings, they all serve as markers of that cycle, signposts for the soul's journey. Bread is both the beginning and the end, the nourishment for both body and spirit. You take a deep breath, inhaling the cool air of the tomb, and for a moment, you feel connected not just to the tomb, not just to Egypt, but to everyone who has ever created something with their hands, whether for the living or the dead. It doesn't matter if it's bread or anything else. The act of creation, of offering something of yourself, is what makes us all immortal. You can't help but smile. Because here, in this quiet space, you know the bread was just the beginning. The real offering was always the care, the thought, the hope. As you make your way back toward the entrance, the scent of the myrrh still lingers. You think of the loaves you've seen, the real ones, the symbolic ones, the ones that smell like 1,000 years of ritual and belief, and you realize that, even now, they are still here, in the air, in the stone. In the light of the torch, somehow, the bread has endured. The tomb's entrance is narrow, and as you step back into the daylight, it feels almost like emerging from a dream. The air outside is warm and dry, the dust of the desert clinging to your skin as if it's trying to remind you of everything you just learned. But something lingers with you, something more than just the smell of ancient bread, more than the sweet, resinous wafts of myrrh that you're beginning to think of as your personal ancient Egyptian cologne. You're standing outside now, blinking against the harsh sunlight. But the story doesn't stop here. Not yet. You've seen the bread in the tombs, the offerings, the symbolic loaves. But there's something else, something more curious still, and it's buried deeper than the earth itself. The mystery bread, the stuff that wasn't just perfumed, but baked with a purpose so precise, so ritualistic, that historians are still baffled by it. It's a strange puzzle piece in this world of resurrecting bread. Some of this mystery, bread didn't even make it into the tombs themselves. It didn't sit in the bowls of pharaohs or the hands of gods. No. This bread was meant for the mourners, the living. And here's where it gets weird. Some tombs were sealed, not just with offerings to the gods, but with a loaf of bread designed to protect everyone living and dead from evil spirits. Some say it was for warding off the Akh, the spirit of misfortune, which could follow the deceased into the afterlife. Others believe it was meant as a kind of spiritual reset, a piece of food that allowed both the dead and their mourners to reach the other side in peace. They called it the sacred loaf, though not in any formal way. It wasn't stamped or engraved with hieroglyphs. Instead, it was a piece of bread so spiritually potent that its mere presence ensured the success of the entire afterlife ritual. And yet, curiously, there are cases where this bread wasn't baked at all, but instead modeled from clay, mixed with water, then brushed with a fine, shiny glaze. This was sacred bread, yes, but it wasn't bread in the sense you and I think of it. More like a religious artifact in loaf form. The glaze on these clay loaves was sometimes infused with oils, or even honey, symbolic sweetness to ensure that the offerings would be received kindly in the afterlife. Now, here's the quirky part that's been perplexing researchers. Sometimes, these loaves were inscribed with tiny images of crocodiles or snakes. That's right. Crocodile bread. Snake bread. Apparently, it was believed that these creatures held power over evil spirits. Not that you'd think of a crocodile as friendly, mind you, but when it comes to Egyptian mythology, the symbolism runs deeper than simple. The crocodile, for example, was both a protector and a fearsome beast, something you could summon to your side to ward off evil spirits. So, the presence of a crocodile-shaped loaf wasn't just a strange food oddity, it was a symbol of divine strength, a charm, a talisman. Imagine walking up to a tomb, seeing the snake or crocodile loaf, and realizing this isn't just bread. This is power. You linger in the warm sunlight outside the tomb, catching your breath. It's hard to fathom that something as simple as bread, something we throw together in our kitchens without a second thought, could carry so much meaning. In ancient Egypt, bread wasn't just for sustenance. It was for protection, it was for memory, it was for love. It was symbolic, spiritual, and as connected to the divine as the incense that wafted through temple corridors. This seems like a lot of weight for a loaf to carry. But then again, maybe it's not so strange. When you think about it, bread has always been much more than just food. It's been a symbol of life, of sharing, of community, of family. You break bread with someone to show them they matter. You share it in moments of joy, but also in moments of loss. Here it's no different. The Egyptians took it a step further, though, weaving bread so deeply into their spiritual fabric that it traveled with them into the afterlife. It was their way of ensuring continuity, a way of making sure their presence, no matter how long gone, still lingered. It's like leaving a trace of yourself behind that could never fully fade away. As long as someone remembered the bread you once offered, you take one last look at the tomb, imagining what it must have been like to walk here thousands of years ago, to place that loaf of bread beside a loved one's body, to say goodbye in the most sacred, most intimate way. And you can almost feel it. The stillness of the air, the heavy weight of the past, the quiet comfort of knowing that even after death, bread would carry on. And just like that, you turn away, feeling the cool air against your face, with the lingering scent of bread and myrrh still hanging in the air around you. You know now that wherever you go, there will always be bread, and in a strange way, it will always be sacred. You find yourself walking down the uneven dirt path leading away from the tomb, but your thoughts are still swirling with everything you've just uncovered about bread, the afterlife, and the profound place this simple food once held in the ancient Egyptian world. The sun is beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the desert, and as you walk, the weight of the past seems to press more heavily on your shoulders. It's fascinating, really. Here you are looking at a barren landscape, and yet, in the distance, you can almost see the bustling life that once thrived here. Temples, festivals, markets everywhere, people working, living, and, most importantly, offering bread. A soft breeze stirs the air, and you can almost smell the faint trace of cinnamon and myrrh once more, as if the tombs themselves are offering a last, lingering gift. The bread, you realize, is never truly gone. It's been preserved, both in the hearts of those who made it and in the stories that have endured long after the bakers themselves passed. You've come to understand something essential. This bread wasn't just a physical object. It wasn't merely sustenance for the body. It was sustenance for the soul. And as the day fades to night, the symbolic meaning of those offerings becomes even clearer. Bread, as a symbol of continuity and renewal, speaks to the very heart of what the Egyptians believed, that death was not an end, but a transformation. Bread was the food that could carry you from one life to the next, that could sustain you through the perilous journey into the afterlife. Walking further, you notice a silhouette on the horizon. It's a figure, standing still, looking out over the sand. It's the figure of a woman, perhaps a servant or a priestess, holding a basket filled with loaves. For a moment, it almost seems as if the desert itself has conjured her this image of ancient life, standing timeless in the glowing twilight. She isn't real, of course, but she's there in your mind, as real as the bread she holds. She's a part of the landscape now, a symbol of the ritual and care that was poured into the making of these sacred loaves. You can't help but feel connected to her in a way. She, too, understood what it meant to give. You walk closer to the figure, but as you do, she fades away. The desert swallows her, and you're left alone with your thoughts. There's something deeply emotional about this moment, the kind of connection that only happens when time collapses and you feel a shared human experience across millennia. She's been gone for so long, but in a sense, she and her bread offerings live on in every story, in every myth, in every loaf baked today. As you walk through the cool desert evening, a thought crosses your mind. Could these ancient people have ever imagined that one day their practices, their bread, their spiritual beliefs would be scrutinized and examined so thoroughly? Probably not. But what they did know, what they believed to their very core, was that they needed to leave something behind, a trace, an offering, a reminder that they once lived, and that the act of living mattered. And that's when it hits you. The bread wasn't just about the dead. It was about the living, too. It was a way to remember, a way to care for those who would one day walk down this path. The bread, the fragrant loaves that were so carefully packed away in tombs, the ones that never turned to dust, served as a bridge, not just between this world and the next, but between the generations. The dead would feast on it, the living would mourn, and the gods would smile at the thought of such devotion. The cycle continued. You glance up at the now starlit sky. The stars twinkle as if giving their approval. Maybe you're not supposed to understand all of this. Maybe it's simply enough to know that, in a strange way, the bread has kept its promise. It's carried on, just like those who baked it, just like those who ate it in their own rituals, and just like the people who've passed the story down through generations. It's a story that will never fully end, and as the night air cools your skin, you feel the faintest echo of an ancient song, a song of remembrance, of connection. A song of bread. You breathe in deeply, tasting the night air. The journey has reached its end, but the memory of those loaves will linger with you forever, like the scent of myrrh that once filled the tombs. It's a reminder of how something as simple as bread can be much more than food. It can be a link to the past, a way of giving, and a way of living on long after we're gone. As you take the final steps out into the desert, away from the tombs and into the quiet darkness, you realize that while the bread may be gone, the story, the spirit, the scent, it all endures. You stand still for a moment, the dark desert stretching out before you, and you realize that you've been walking through time itself. Every step, every breath has been accompanied by the whispers of those who lived and passed so long ago. The bread, the tombs, the rituals, everything you've seen, felt, and learned is woven together in a single, delicate thread that runs through all of history. And even now, as the night deepens, you sense that this thread isn't just about Egypt. It's universal. It's about memory. It's about what we leave behind. As the cool night wind picks up, you realize that you've become part of the story too. That's the thing about history, it's not just something that happens to the past. It's something that happens to us, right here and now. You're not just reading about the bread the Egyptians left behind. You're experiencing it, feeling its weight, its significance. It's almost as if you've shared a meal with those ancient souls, breaking bread with them in the space between worlds. But let's take a step back. Remember how this whole journey started? With a loaf of bread that wasn't meant for eating. The kind that had been baked, sealed, and embalmed. That bread may have been a symbol, an offering, a ritual, but there's more to it than that. That bread represents something fundamental about what it means to be human. The desire to be remembered, to be seen, to be part of something larger than ourselves. To make sure that when we're gone, the world we leave behind will carry a piece of us forward. Even in something as simple as bread. And, in the quiet of this night, you think about all the generations that came before. The bakers, the priests, the mourners, all of them are gone now, their names forgotten, their faces lost to the sands of time. But their offerings, their bread, still live on. That's the secret to immortality, isn't it? It's not about statues or monuments. It's not about leaving behind a big, flashy legacy. It's about the small, quiet things, the things that endure. You turn your face to the sky, letting the cool night air wash over you. The stars, far away but so close, twinkle with ancient light. It's impossible not to feel connected to all of it. The bread, the tombs, the love, the loss, the continuity. The way the scent of myrrh still lingers in your mind, even now, even after all this time, you find yourself thinking about your own life, about what you'll leave behind. Will it be something like the Egyptians did? Will your actions, your gifts, your gestures be remembered in some small, yet enduring way? You can't say for sure. But standing here in the cool desert night, you start to believe that maybe, in the end, it's the smallest things that carry the most weight. The bread the Egyptians left behind was far more than a food offering. It was a gift. It was an act of love and remembrance. And that love, that devotion, has carried through the centuries, across time and space. The bread, though long forgotten, still serves its purpose to ensure that the ones who made it are remembered. That the ones who tasted it are not lost to history. You realize that the tombs, with their perfumed loaves and ancient offerings, aren't just places of death. They are monuments to life, to the relationships, the rituals, and the deep love that transcends the boundaries of time. The bread they baked was a form of connection, a bridge between the living and the dead, and it worked. In ways they never could have imagined, those loaves have ensured that their story is still alive. As you walk away from the tombs, back into the stillness of the desert night, you carry the weight of their story with you. It's no longer just something you've learned. It's something you've become a part of, a witness to their memory, a keeper of their bread. And maybe, just maybe, that's what makes us all eternal. You pause at the edge of the sand, letting the last faint traces of the night settle in. The desert stretches out endlessly before you, an eternal landscape, unchanged by time. But somewhere, beneath the ground, in the quiet chambers of the tombs, the bread still rests, and it still smells of myrrh in the stillness. The bread lives on. The desert stretches endlessly in front of you, its quiet vastness offering a certain calm that the world rarely grants. It's hard not to think that, perhaps, the Egyptians had figured something out that modern life has long forgotten. They didn't just focus on the here and now, they focused on the enduring essence of things. The soul, the spirit, the journey. Even something as simple as bread became a vehicle. For carrying those things forward, you walk, each step sinking slightly into the sand, and a thought occurs to you. Bread wasn't just about ritual for the Egyptians. It was about connection. Not just to the gods or to the afterlife, but to each other. To the community, to family. You've seen it all. From the rich, perfumed loaves to the humble, clay replicas. The meticulous care in each. The time spent ensuring every crumb, every grain, every cent would carry its message forward. And that's the thing, isn't it? It's not about grand gestures or flashy monuments. The Egyptians could have built towering pyramids, crafted golden masks, or buried themselves with jewels. And they did. But what really mattered, the real gift they gave to the world, the piece of themselves that endured, was the bread. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't monumental. It was quiet. It was humble. And it was deeply, profoundly human. That's why you've found yourself walking through these tombs, learning not just about bread, but about the essence of life itself. The way a single loaf, when made with love, devotion, and a deep respect for the cycle of life, can transcend the moment. It can become more than food. It becomes a symbol, a message, a prayer. It becomes part of a story that endures long after its maker is gone. You can feel the weight of this realization settle on your shoulders, as if the desert itself is pressing down on you in a gentle, unspoken acknowledgement. The loaves you've encountered, each one unique, each one a piece of the puzzle, more than just artifacts. They are the very embodiment of the Egyptians' understanding of time, memory, and existence. In a way, it's comforting. The bread, after all, didn't just nourish the body, nourished the soul. It didn't just fill the stomach, it filled the heart. And that's what the Egyptians wanted, to ensure that even in death, they would continue to nourish those who remembered them. Even when they were no longer here, their presence would linger in the scent of myrrh and the warmth of the bread. You pause for a moment, gazing out at the vastness of the desert horizon. It feels as though you're standing on the edge of something ancient, something eternal. In the distance, the faint outlines of more tombs are visible, silently marking the passage of time. You imagine the people who once walked this land, who lived and died here. Their lives marked not by the grand monuments they built, but by the small, intimate gestures they made, like the bread they packed into tombs, the loaves they crafted. With such care and reverence, and then, as you stand there, something quiet shifts in the air, a shift that feels like the very fabric of time folding in on itself. It's a shift you can't explain, but you know that the journey you've been on isn't over. The bread, the tombs, the stories, all of it is still here, in the air, in the sand, in the stars overhead. It's as if the past is reaching out to you, inviting you to become part of it, to carry its memory forward. You breathe deeply, letting the cool air fill your lungs, and for a moment, you feel the faintest trace of the bread's scent, the myrrh, the spices, the warmth, as if it's still with you, lingering like a memory that refuses to fade. And maybe that's the final secret the Egyptians left us. That memory, true memory, doesn't fade. It persists. It lingers in the smallest, quietest things, the scent of bread, the warmth of a moment, the trace of a gesture. It's not the grand monuments or the flashy riches that endure. It's the small acts of love and remembrance that truly stand the test of time. As you turn and begin your walk back, the bread still lingers in your mind. You think about the people who made it, the stories they told with each loaf, and the way their bread still nourishes us all. Even after so many millennia, the night stretches on, but the memory of the bread, their bread, will remain with you forever. You begin to walk again, each step drawing you deeper into the tranquil silence of the desert night. The stars twinkle above you, distant and ancient, but somehow close. Like old friends who have seen it all, and whose company you've come to rely on. There's something comforting in the stillness, the way the world seems to slow down as you move further away from the tombs. The bread, though, still lingers with you, etched into your mind like the faintest scent that refuses to leave. The path ahead is barely visible in the fading light, yet the stars seem to light the way, guiding your steps with a quiet, steady grace. You think about the Egyptians again, the way they must have looked at the world. There was an elegance in their understanding of death and the afterlife, but it wasn't all grandiose. No, it was in the small things, the way a loaf of bread, the simplest of foods, could be packed with such meaning. Every crumb, every rise, every cent was part of a ritual, a larger cycle that connected the living and the dead, the gods and the mortals. The bread they offered wasn't just for survival. It was a token, a bridge between worlds, meant to nourish the soul as much as the body. It's almost as though they understood that life, no matter how short, was fleeting. But in the offering, in the remembrance, in the giving of something as humble as bread, they transcended time. They ensured that their essence would continue long after they were gone. As you walk, the quiet of the desert seems to grow deeper, the world itself fading into a soft, comforting lull. And then you realize it's not just the desert that feels still, it's your mind, too. For the first time since entering the tombs, you feel truly present, not lost in thought or swept away by distractions, but here, now, and it's as though the bread, the myrrh, the rituals, it all makes sense. It's the human need to be remembered, to leave something behind that speaks of who we were. The Egyptians knew that, and they gave it to us through their bread. You can almost hear the soft crackling of the dough as it baked in ancient ovens, the delicate, spiced fragrance wafting through the air, just as it must have done so long ago. And in that moment, you realize something even deeper. Bread isn't just food. It's a memory made tangible. It's a connection made solid. And for all their grand monuments and towering pyramids, the Egyptians knew that the simplest offerings, like bread, were the most profound. It's a thought that lingers as the night stretches on, the desert's silence wrapping around you like a blanket. The stars above shine brighter now, as if they, too, are offering a gift. They're part of the same cycle, the same grand dance that has been taking place for millennia. And you're a part of it too. In your own small way, you've connected to something larger than yourself. You've touched the past, and the past has touched you. And in doing so, you've carried a piece of it forward. You stop, just for a moment, letting the stillness settle deeper into your bones. The bread, the offerings, the stories, they are no longer just relics of a distant past. They've become part of you, too. You understand now that the Egyptians didn't just create tombs, or rituals, or offerings. They created a legacy. And the legacy wasn't about wealth or power. It was about the simple, enduring things that connect us all. Bread, memory, love. The thought brings a sense of peace. You inhale the cool desert air, savoring the quiet, the vastness, the deep connection that exists between all things, life, death, bread, and memory. They're all part of the same cycle. And the Egyptians, in their wisdom, understood that perhaps better than anyone. They knew that the smallest things could carry the greatest meaning, and so, as the night continues to unfold around you, you take one last look at the tombs in the distance. Their outlines are soft now, barely visible in the dim light, but you know they'll remain. Just as the bread, the stories, the rituals, they'll remain too. Not just in the tombs, not just in the history books, but in the very air you breathe, the earth beneath your feet, and the stars above. They've endured, and they will continue to endure, long after you've left this desert behind. You smile softly to yourself, a sense of contentment washing over you. The journey, it seems, isn't just about uncovering the past, it's about carrying it forward. And in doing so, it becomes part of the present, part of the future. The bread, the tombs, the rituals, they're all still with us, living on, nourishing us in ways we may never fully understand. You step away from the open desert, back toward a weathered excavation site where small tents flap gently in the wind. There's something almost domestic about tea kettles clinking, a dusty notebook half buried beneath an archaeological brush, the faint sound of a generator ticking. It's jarring, honestly. After all that time immersed in tombs, shadows, and sacred bread, the clutter of modern life feels almost comical, but you're still thinking about the bread. You can't stop. It's taken root in your mind. Because now you're wondering, how did they make it? Not just what they mixed in or what it symbolized, but how they physically made bread durable enough to last thousands of years. Or at least long enough to survive the burial rites. And then there's the bigger question, was it ever actually meant to be eaten at all? The more you think about it, the stranger it gets. In some tombs, archaeologists have found loaves so perfectly preserved, you could almost mistake them for freshly baked. But when studied under microscopes, they reveal an entirely different picture. These weren't your average daily breads. No yeast, no puffed crust, just dense, sometimes underbaked, often shaped with religious or mythological symbols, and occasionally hardened on purpose. Some loaves were charred slightly, as if on the edge of being burnt, intentionally singed, possibly to mimic the transformation by fire associated with sacred offerings. Historians still argue whether these breads were even edible. Some say they were purely symbolic, designed only to look like food. Others argue they may have been baked specifically for funerary feasts before being sealed away. The fact that many loaves were found in proximity to perfume jars, oil vessels, and incense burners adds to the mystery. Was this all one giant, choreographed farewell meal? One particular loaf you recall from the records was oval, jet black, and infused with sycamore fig syrup and thick oil, almost lacquered. It had the consistency of something between biscotti and brick. You remember the note from a researcher who tried to replicate it and joked that chewing it was like biting into history if history were a sandal. So, no, not a dinner roll. You smile at that, imagining an ancient Egyptian priest solemnly placing a loaf in a tomb while muttering sacred incantations, and somewhere in the back of his mind, thinking, there's no way this thing is edible. And then there's the question of who made the bread. It wasn't just anyone. Bread making was a serious business, especially when it came to funerary purposes. There were bakers assigned specifically to temples, trained not only in making bread, but in crafting sacred shapes, adhering to purity laws, and preparing ingredients ritually. In some temple complexes, the bakery was placed directly beside the embalming house. That's right next to the place where bodies were treated and wrapped. Strange, absolutely, but also kind of brilliant. It made logistical sense. Bake the offerings while the deceased was being prepared. One long day of ceremony, scent, and quiet craftsmanship. You wonder how that must have felt to be the bread maker of the dead. Imagine the silence of the workspace, the repetitive motion of kneading dough as chants echoed from nearby rooms, the smell of flour and oil mixing with incense and resin, the understanding that every loaf you shaped wasn't just food, but farewell, that your job was to send souls into the next world with something warm, something familiar. There's something achingly human about that, isn't there? You run your hand over a replica mold on the work table, rough clay with a shallow oval cavity. Some molds had animal shapes, some bore lotus petals, and a few were made to mimic the sun rising over the horizon. It's all so precise, every shape, every curve, every scent. A performance. An art. You start to understand that the bread wasn't just left in the tomb as a throwaway gesture. It was the result of an entire industry, quiet, reverent, painstaking. Imagine a young apprentice learning how to twist a perfumed loaf into a spiral, practicing until the shape was just right. Or an elderly baker sitting near the ovens, adjusting the fire with practiced ease, knowing exactly when the dough had gone from raw to ritually ready. And again, always that fragrance. The myrrh, the frankincense, the wood smoke, sometimes a hint of coriander or fenugreek, depending on the season. Not only did it make the tomb smell sacred, but it helped mask the decay of the body during the early stages of burial. These weren't just loaves, they were ancient aromatherapy. A spiritual air freshener with a deeper purpose. You can't help but think, too, about how this bread was never supposed to be rediscovered. It was meant to stay sealed away, never to be touched, let alone handled by future people in puffy down vests with clipboards. But here you are centuries later, tracing the edge of a mold, wondering what ancient hands last touched it. There's something so quiet about all of this. Not sad, not eerie, just still, peaceful. Like the bread and the dead made a silent pact. You go on ahead. I'll stay here to remember you. And somehow, it worked. You look up again. The wind's changed. The tents rustle. A kettle boils somewhere behind you, but you're not ready to return to the present just yet. You close your eyes, and for a moment, you're back there, again among the loaves. The silence, the scent of rising dough laced with sacred smoke. And for the first time, you truly feel what the ancient Egyptians might have meant by eternity. The sky above you is deepening to velvet now. A wide, endless sweep of indigo scattered with pinpricks of light. The excavation site behind you has grown quiet. Just a few muffled footsteps and the occasional zip of a tent flap carried on the breeze. But you don't move. You're still here, crouched beside that replica mold, as if afraid to break the spell. The more you reflect on it, the more astonishing it becomes. How profoundly the Egyptians cared about what happened after. Their lives were shaped around it. Their architecture, their art, their most ordinary Daily tasks, especially the baking of bread, were all designed with one eye fixed on eternity. And nowhere is that clearer than in the staggering precision of their funerary recipes. Yes, recipes. Turns out, there are fragments of instructions left behind, lists, ratios, shapes, even temperature control methods that were handed down from baker to baker, like sacred rites. Some of these were scratched onto pottery shards, others embedded into tomb inscriptions. You think back to the funerary cone you saw earlier, the one with not a name or a title, but a single recipe carved into its underside. It wasn't for stew, not wine, not dessert, bread. A specific kind, too, a cone-shaped barley loaf infused with date mash and crushed lupin. According to the fragment, it had to be baked on a flat granite slab over an open fire, then cooled for a full night beneath stars. That last instruction makes you pause. It wasn't just about flavor. It was ritual. The night sky would bless the loaf before it joined the tomb's other offerings. Historians still debate whether these recipes were symbolic themselves. Some argue the instructions were spiritual metaphors meant more for ceremony than consumption. Others suggest that particular breads could trap essences of the deceased or of the gods, kind of like a divine sponge made of grain. But there's one theory that really sticks with you. It's the idea that perfumed bread wasn't just for the dead or for the gods, but also for communication. That when baked properly, an offering loaf could carry messages, not in words, obviously, but in scent, in form, in ritual. The smell of the spices, the shape of the loaf, the warmth from the oven, they all spoke together. It was like lighting incense, only more substantial. Something to hold, something to place gently beside a loved one and whisper, "You're not alone." You lean back, hands behind you in the sand, and imagine yourself as one of those ancient bakers. You picture a dusty little bread house tucked behind a limestone wall. Inside, there's a domed oven, low fire, slow heat. A mixture of barley flour, water, palm oil, and date syrup bubbling in a bowl. Someone brings in a basket of herbs, marjoram maybe, or crushed chamomile. The baker takes a pinch, stirs it in, then he closes his eyes, listens, not to a voice, but to the rhythm of the ritual, the song of the moment. Then he shapes the loaf, not for flavor or shelf life, but for memory. There's a quiet holiness to the act, and the result, a dark, fragrant bundle of warmth meant to survive death itself. And survive it did. Archaeologists have uncovered entire niches inside tombs lined with bread, many of them sealed in ceramic jars or tucked beneath layers of cloth, and in a few rare cases, the jars had labels scratched in crude hieratic script, like your grandmother scribbling on a freezer bag. One label read, "For the night," another simply said, "Still warm." That one stays with you. Still warm. As if the loaf had just been pulled from the oven, even as it was packed away to follow the dead. It's almost heartbreaking in its gentleness. This bread wasn't placed in tombs to impress anyone. It wasn't for glory or status or show. It was for comfort, for memory, for company. And that's what makes it so utterly human. You glance down again at the bread mold on the table, and you feel something shift inside you. All this time, you thought the Egyptians packed perfumed loaves to please the gods, to fuel the soul's long journey, to impress Osiris or bribe Anubis. And sure, maybe they did all that, but more than anything, they packed that bread so no One would be alone. The night deepens, and the air cools, but you don't move right away. You sit still, watching the desert stretch out before you, imagining the thousands, tens of thousands of loaves tucked into tombs beneath your feet. Their scents may have faded, their shapes crumbled, but the intent remains. The love remains, and the message lingers. You mattered. You are remembered. Even now. You finally rise from where you'd been sitting, your joints stiffed from stillness, your thoughts heavy with the weight of what you've absorbed. But there's still more to this strange, sleepy journey. One last detour less about the loaves themselves, and more about how the idea of bread as remembrance refused to die. Even after the tomb doors were sealed forever, you begin walking again, not toward a monument this time, but toward a cluster of low sun-baked walls, once the outer edges of a workers' village. Not the homes of pharaohs or priests, but the ordinary people. The ones who mixed the dough, built the tombs, wove the linens. These were the hands behind the glory. And if you listen closely, you can still feel them here, brushing against the air. And what's the first thing you notice as you walk into their space? An oven. Not a shrine, not a statue. An oven right in the center of a tiny square courtyard. The very heart of the home. Shallow, dome-shaped, blackened from years of use. It looks a little like a beehive, sunken slightly into the ground. Around it, traces of ash, bits of charred seed, and a few cracked bowls that might have once held flour or beer mash. And on the wall, a faint carving, nothing fancy. Just a simple etching of a loaf, domed on top, surrounded by 3 dots. It doesn't scream mythology, it doesn't need to. It says enough. Bread was life. And more than that, it was continuity. These people weren't baking for gods. They were baking for each other. For their children. For their parents. For the neighbor who lost a husband last season and needed something warm in the morning. That, in many ways, is just as sacred. The archaeologists who studied this place noted that the floor around the oven was more worn than anywhere else in the home. Even more than the doorframe. That's how much time they spent here. Kneeling, measuring, shaping, waiting. You imagine generations of hands, older ones guiding younger ones, showing them how to test the flour between fingers. How to know when the dough is ready just by the scent. No recipe scrolls. Just memory passed down through fingertips. And here's where things take a stranger turn. In one of the side rooms, someone had scratched a list of names into the wall, now barely visible. Most likely family members, perhaps a prayer or a roll call. But next to one of the names, someone drew a tiny loaf. Just one, like a punctuation mark, or maybe an offering. No one knows what it meant. Historians still argue whether it was a form of commemoration, or just a baker's casual graffiti, but the fact that bread shows up there in a private, unimportant house, scratched into a dusty wall says everything. It wasn't just for royalty. It wasn't just for ritual. It was the language of life. The way you told someone you're safe here, you're fed here, you're remembered. And you start to see how perfumed tomb bread wasn't some elite custom. It was the upscale version of something deeper, something ordinary, universal. Bread as legacy. Back outside, you pause to look at the landscape one more time. You know now that beneath your feet lie not just bodies, but stories baked into loaves, infused with oils. Shaped by generations of people who feared death and yet met it with generosity. Their afterlife didn't start at death. It started with the kneading, the baking, the scent of coriander rising through the early morning air. You think of all the loaves that never made it into tombs. The ones eaten at funeral feasts, broken into bits, and shared by mourners. Some historians believe this communal meal was as vital as the burial itself, the final chance to speak of the dead. While the scent of warm bread still lingered. One peculiar tidbit from a funerary site. In a basket near an entrance not deep in the tomb, but right by the threshold, archaeologists found what they first assumed was a broken loaf. Turns out it was intentionally split in half, its edges carefully crumbled. Why? Likely to ensure it couldn't be stolen by spirits or misused by the wrong soul. A kind of ghost-proofing, if you will. You chuckle. Even in death, the Egyptians had food security protocols. You wonder if they ever imagined their bread would outlive their names, their dynasties, their empires. If they knew that, thousands of years later, someone would stand in the dust of their kitchens and feel, so vividly, the warmth they left behind. And maybe that's the most extraordinary part. They didn't bake to be remembered. They baked because they loved. And in doing so, they ended up remembered anyway. You look up at the sky. It's almost morning now. The stars are fading. The first hint of rose touches the edge of the horizon. You breathe in deeply, half hoping the air still carries a trace of that sacred bread. You swear it does. Or maybe that's just memory playing tricks again. Either way, the smell is comforting. You close your eyes, and in the stillness, you hear it, the soft hush of hands on dough, the crackle of a hearth, the whispered names of those who came before, and the silent, eternal promise wrapped in every loaf, I was here. The sun is just beginning to rise now, casting long golden lines across the desert. The sand looks like it's glowing, like someone gently poured honey over the entire horizon. And you, somehow, are still here, still listening to the loaves, still wondering how something so plain could hold so much. You begin your final walk, this time not toward a tomb or a ruin, but simply following the curve of a dried-up riverbed that must have once carried water from the Nile. It winds lazily across the sand like a memory slowly disappearing, and as you follow it, you begin to think not about the bread anymore, but about the people who made it. Not the gods, not the pharaohs, the real ones, the ones who woke up before dawn. The ones who kneaded the dough in silence. The ones who inhaled the scent of warm grain and felt, for a moment, that they were holding something sacred. You imagine them lining up the loaves, each one shaped carefully, maybe marked with thumbprints. A little dent in the center, a pressed sprig of something green. Not perfect, but full of intention, full of love. And those loaves, wrapped in cloth, placed gently next to a body, were never meant to rot. They were meant to last. That was the hope, that the bread would endure. Just long enough for the soul to wake up and find it waiting. But not all of it was baked for the dead. Some of it, plenty of it, was meant to be eaten by the living. Not because they were hungry, but because they were grieving. This was something you hadn't quite understood until now. The funerary feasts. The way the mourners, after all the rituals and rapping and weeping, would gather quietly outside the tomb, break the bread, and eat. They didn't just eat to remember. They ate to anchor themselves. To remind their bodies that life continued, that despite the weight of death and silence, there was still flavor, still warmth, still something worth putting in your mouth and chewing slowly, thoughtfully, with tears on your face and a breeze at your back. Historians still debate whether those feasts were joyful or solemn. Some texts suggest quiet reverence. Others hint at something more celebratory, final send-off with music and wine. The truth is, probably somewhere in between. After all, grief is strange like that. Sometimes, the best thing you can do for someone you've lost is to eat a piece of bread in their name. Tell a story about them, and then let the day move on. And in this moment, with the desert warming around you and the morning creeping closer, you begin to understand how bread became not just sacred but reliable. It's always there. It doesn't need to be fancy. It doesn't need applause. It just is. Whether you're a pharaoh with gold in your tomb or a baker with ash on your apron, bread is the one thing you can count on. And maybe that's why it was packed into tombs in the first place. Not just because it was sustenance, but because it was familiar. It was the smell of home, the texture of memory, a soft, fragrant echo of life in a place where everything else had grown still. You picture a soul awakening in the afterlife, blinking, stretching, stepping carefully through the veil. What do they find waiting? Not jewels, not scrolls, not fanfare, just a loaf, slightly sweet, still warm, and that, somehow, is enough. You reach the end of the dry riverbed and sit down, legs folded beneath you, the sand still cool from the night. You close your eyes, and for the first time, you let the full weight of everything you've learned settle into your chest. The shapes, the rituals, the spices, the careful wrapping, the slow cooling beneath stars. And above all, the love baked into every crumb. You smile softly, eyes still closed. The desert is quiet. The bread is eternal. The story is yours now, and now. Slowly, gently, you can let it all go. You've walked through tombs. You've stood beside ovens. You've watched the desert shimmer under moonlight, and sat beside loaves that were never meant to be eaten. You've listened to the quiet language of grain and oil and spice. You've heard the soft whisper of myrrh rising from a stone jar. And somehow, it's all wrapped around you now, this ancient hush. This warmth. You can feel it settling into your breath, softening your thoughts, loosening the knots behind your eyes. There's nothing more to chase. The bread has been baked. The tombs are sealed. The stars have made their slow descent into dawn. And here you are, safe, still, weightless. With every breath, the world fades further into a gentle haze. You remember the scent of coriander, the sound of fire crackling in a clay oven. You remember how even in silence, there was connection. Even in death, there was comfort. Even in the driest places on earth, something warm endured. Let your mind drift now. Let the images melt into sleep. Let the ancient ovens cool, and the loaves rest on their linen beds. Everything is okay. The offerings were made, the dead were remembered, and you are still here, still warm, still carried by the story. Good night, my friend. Sleep deeply. Sleep well.
you.